What's up guys, Ryan here, Flyfish, Iowa. Hey, let's talk fish species identification. One of the issues I see with anglers and even the general public is that we don't have a correct understanding of what fish species actually exist in our local waterways. So as a part of our Midwest 101 series, we're going to dive into distinguishing features of different fish species and how you can identify different fish. Let's start with our sunfish family. That includes our bass species, our sunfish species, and our crappie species. The most common sunfish that you will see in Iowa and in the Midwest is bluegill. Bluegill are thought to be native to much of the eastern United States as well as into the Mississippi River drainage, which would include Iowa. Bluegill typically have a relatively small mouth. They have a pretty dark spot right above their operculum, and that dark spot has a dark border or no border at all. Bluegill often will have little bars across the side of them, but not necessarily always. Bluegill are able to hybridize with other species too, which can make identification somewhat tricky because you might have bluegill features that exist in other sunfish hybrids. The green sunfish is another popular sunfish that exists in the Midwest. And a green sunfish has a similar appearance to a bluegill, but a green sunfish has a larger mouth, typically a little more elongated and a little more bass-like than a bluegill. And it also has very distinct yellow tips on a lot of its fins, especially the fins on the ventral or underside of the fish and that caudal fin, the tail. Also, on that little dark spot that the bluegill had, that dark spot will have a little bit of color or border on the outside of that dark spot. Pumpkin seed sunfish are, in my opinion, some of the prettiest sunfish that are out there. Pumpkin seed sunfish have these sort of light blue markings along their cheeks and along their operculum. They also have very colorful spots all throughout their body. And then finally, the red ear sunfish is another common sunfish. And the red ear sunfish looks similar to a pumpkin seed sunfish, but it's a little less vivid in color. They do have a distinct red tip on their ear, on the operculum, right outside that dark spot as well. All right, let's talk bass. Bass identification is much easier if you know what water body you're talking about. So if we're talking about water bodies that have moving water, cold water, clean water, those are typically going to be great smallmouth habitat. Smallmouth really need good water quality in order to be successful. Smallmouth bass do exist in lakes as well, and very rarely in ponds, but typically in those cold, clear streams, that's great smallmouth habitat. Some people tell me that they were catching smallmouth bass in their local farm pond, and I'm usually pretty skeptical because most farm ponds are very warm in the summertime. They typically don't have a lot of gravel and substrate that smallmouth bass need. Also, farm ponds typically don't have the cleanest water out there. Smallmouth bass have an upper jaw that does not extend past the eye of the fish. They tend to have a more mottled look where they have these sort of dark vertical bars kind of scattered throughout their body. And they are nicknamed bronzebacks because they typically have a bronze or dark brown color. Largemouth bass, on the other hand, have an upper jaw that extends beyond the eye. They do have a very large mouth. They typically are more of an olive or green color, and they have generally a single black bar that extends horizontally through the fish. And there will be some little vertical lines in there as well, but a largemouth bass generally has a much more distinct horizontal black line than a smallmouth bass does. In Iowa, most of our ponds are going to hold largemouth bass, and a lot of our reservoirs. We do have some largemouth bass in our river systems as well. Now, black and white crappie are very similar to one another, and they both are thought to be native to the Mississippi River drainage, as well as a lot of the eastern United States. Now they actually exist in all of the lower 48 states. Black crappie have more dorsal fin spines than white crappie do, and so it actually makes white crappie almost look like they're missing a dorsal fin at some points. Black crappie tend to be more rounded. White crappie sometimes will be a little more elongated, and they can be more pale. White crappie have significant vertical black bars in their body. Not a ton of them, but a few. Now, the color is not a great way to distinguish black to white crappie because during spawning season, even white crappie can get to be very, very dark. A quick note about crappie, they are very unpredictable in ponds as far as how they can change the population dynamics of a pond. Crappie might be able to coexist with bass and sunfish in some ponds, and they might do great. But sometimes a crappie population will unexpectedly explode, and when there's a ton of crappie that just suddenly pop up in a pond, they need food, and their food source is pretty much the fry of other fish species. And they will go and target all of those bass fry and all of those bluegill fry in that pond. And if the pond's small especially, they can actually wipe out those bass and bluegill populations pretty much altogether. And then all that you're left with in the pond is crappie. And you might think, oh yeah, that's awesome. But the problem is If there's a bunch of crappie in the pond and nothing else, those crappie don't have much to eat because they tend to focus on those fish fry. And so if all that's left is crappie and the crappie don't have much food, those crappie are going to be stunted. They're going to be small. And you don't want to have a pond that's just stuck with a bunch of stunted little crappie and nothing else. So please don't illegally transport species from one pond to another, especially crappie. Some ponds, they're great fisheries, and that's because their crappie populations are in check or they don't have any crappie at all. Finally, let's talk trout. Rainbow trout are the most popular trout in the world. Now, rainbow trout have a very distinct reddish-pink band that goes laterally along their body. Rainbow trout are introduced to Iowa. They are not native. They are native to the western United States as well as the eastern side of Asia around Russia, but they are introduced all over the world as well as the United States. Specifically in Iowa, we see them introduced in the driftless region of northeast Iowa, and we also see them introduced periodically to some of our urban parks and ponds. There's actually only one trout species that's native to Iowa, and it's not even technically a trout, and that is the brook trout. The brook trout is actually a char species, and char species have very distinct white-tipped fins on the underside of their body. Brook trout also have vermiculation, or these worm-like markings on the top of their body, on the dorsal side of their body. Brook trout have red spots that have blue halos scattered throughout their body. Brook trout typically are pretty small, but there are some larger specimens that do show up. Now, something that people often do is confuse brook trout with brown trout. Brown trout are not native to Iowa, nor are they native to North America. Brown trout are native to Europe, and they were introduced to North America, but we do have, even in Iowa, wild and healthy reproducing brown trout populations that now exist. Brown trout look different than brook trout. Brown trout have red spots, yes, but they don't have the blue halos around them. Brown trout also are typically more of a golden brown color, especially under their bellies. They tend to be a yellowish color. Now, brook trout and brown trout both do spawn in the fall. And so in the fall, you're going to see that brook trout and brown trout dig out little nests in the gravel in streams. Those are called redds. And in those redds, they lay their eggs. So if you're ever walking around in a stream in the fall, be paying attention for these clean gravel spots that could be places where brown trout and brook trout lay their eggs, especially in the wintertime too. Be on the lookout for those so that you don't stomp on those redds and kill all those eggs or fry that are in the redds. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out the other fish identification videos. Tight lines, we'll see you on the water.